So it's a very warm welcome to the Global Business Podcast show today to Hayley Blieden. Hayley, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
You're very welcome, and we were just having a nice chat beforehand and working out some of the technical challenges. It's not so easy these days, is it? Just jumping online and thinking everything's going to work?
No, but we're having a lot of practice here in Melbourne, Australia, where we can't currently leave our house due to stage 4 restrictions.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about where you were, and Melbourne's probably dealing with some of the tougher lockdowns than any part of Australia at the moment. How's it been personally for you when all that happened?
I think that everybody is experiencing different challenges at the moment, from personal to work. We've been really fortunate in our business that we have been able to continue operating because we're considered an essential service or a permitted service. Which is a technical term for we're allowed to go to work during stage 4 lockdown.
Yeah.
And we're allowed to access childcare, which I think for us has been the deal breaker because we've got 2 children and they're both currently at childcare. So we're able to continue working during the day, sometimes from the office, sometimes from home, depending on what needs to go on. But I think the challenges for us have been the isolation, so being at home 23 hours out of the day, the limited access to friends and family, the inability to get out to Indigenous communities throughout Australia to visit the communities that we work with. So it's meant that we are really relying on the internet and relying on Zoom meetings to stay connected to the communities that we work with, because it's such a big part of our business.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, we're going to get into a lot of that in detail as we have a chat today. But the first thing I wanted to do is what I do for most of my guests, is to offer you the opportunity to dedicate the show to someone special in life. So who would you like to dedicate your podcast show to today?
I am going to dedicate the podcast, and this is going to sound really corny, but to my husband, who has been my rock during COVID. And, you know, we've never been closer than we are right now, in proximity and in life. As we do this podcast, he's about 1 metre over my shoulder because it's been really challenging, and he has been my support through everything, you know, from coming with me to China when my baby was 3 months old to exhibit, to dropping the kids off at school at childcare every day so that I can get a few extra hours in. He's really been my support through and through over the last 6 months, but also since we launched the business 5 years ago.
Brilliant. What's your husband's name?
His name's Gary.
Gary. Okay, shout out for you, Gary.
There aren't too many Garys left, or there aren't any new ones being introduced. We came across a Gary dog the other day, which was kind of funny because it's like Ralph, which happens to be my father's name. Now there are only dogs called Ralph.
Well, I'll tell you what, I know a lot of Garys, and it's probably because they're my generation, right? But yeah, there's a lot of Garys out here. But this one's for your Gary, and you guys can sit down and watch this a little bit later over a bowl of popcorn or something, yeah, and have a chat about it. So that's a lovely dedication. Thank you for doing that. Now, you were just saying to me before we started today that you have something special that you want to share with all of my audience today. That's very Australian, and I'm going to hand it over to you now to do that.
Thank you. And this is something I've never done on a podcast before, and I feel like it's really special. I was lucky enough to participate in a seminar last week run by Red Dust Role Models, which is our not-for-profit partner. And it was run by a couple of the Indigenous guys that are based up in the Northern Territory. And they were talking about welcome to country and acknowledgement of country. So for all of those that don't know what those two practices are, a welcome to country is done by an Indigenous person when you enter their land. So imagine you walk into someone's house, they welcome you to their house. An acknowledgement of country is done by an Indigenous or non-Indigenous person when you're on someone else's land. So by the term land, I don't know if that's unique to Australia, but there were over 500 Indigenous clans in Australia prior to white settlement. And those clans were well-defined little mini countries. They had borders, they had their own language, they had their own flag. And when you went onto someone else's land, you were welcomed by that Indigenous group onto their land. An acknowledgement of country is done by a non-Indigenous or an Indigenous person on someone else's land. So basically saying, thank you for having me. And if you Google acknowledgement of country, there's a standard acknowledgement of country that everyone seems to do when they enter a meeting or if they enter a music concert or something like that. And during this seminar, they were talking about how today it's almost lost meaning, that you get up, you say you're welcome to country, you tick that box, you sing the national anthem, and you move on. And they were talking about how the most important acknowledgement of country that they have participated in was done by year 2 boys. Wow. And they stood up and they said an acknowledgement of country, an acknowledgement of, to their session that they wrote themselves, and that had so much meaning. So we decided to go and write our own acknowledgement of country for the Australian Superfood Co.
Fantastic.
So I thought I'd share that. I shared it with the team only a few hours ago, so it's very new, but I thought I'd share it with you today.
Wonderful. World exclusive right here. Okay, let's go.
The Australian Superfood Co. acknowledges and pays respect to the past, present and emerging traditional custodians and elders of this nation, particularly the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land with which we live and work on. It is the responsibility of every Australian to not just care for this country, but to celebrate the bounty of ingredient it blesses us with, thanks to the environmental, social and cultural practice of the 500 nations thriving here prior to European settlement. We promise to respect and honour this country's traditional owners and to educate current and future landowners on the benefits of planting and harvesting native produce. We commit to continuing our journey together, working to build a prosperous and inclusive future that honours Australia's rich Indigenous heritage.
Beautiful.
And now we can start.
Wow, no, that you've nailed it, and I loved it. I love the concept. I love the words. I would even be so bold to suggest an additional word for you to add, if you could.
Absolutely.
Because I think in terms of, in the beginning you talked about Australians, but we should also include anybody that visits the country, so tourists as well, I think should have that respect. So for all the people that are listening to the show around the world today who are waiting to book their tickets to come to Australia, they should be getting a copy of what you've just written, and also acknowledging that when they arrive here in this country, because ultimately a lot of us arrived here at some stage, didn't we? Regardless of what ancestry and generation, we all arrived in this country as immigrants from wherever around the world, and I loved it. Well done to you, Hayley.
Thank you.
That's really good.
And I think that the most important thing about that is acknowledging that Australia's history didn't start 200 years ago when Captain Cook landed on our shores, which for many of us, I'm in my 30s, and when we were at school, that's what we learnt, was Australia's history started 200 years ago. And it didn't. It started thousands and thousands of years ago. And there was a rich civilization that was based in Australia, and we can learn a lot from them. And I think that it's only now that the conversation is really starting. And, with situations like the bushfires, which we encountered in January last year, that there are Indigenous practices that could have prevented those bushfires. So going back, learning about the history, having conversations and acknowledging the people that were here beforehand, the people that are currently here, and the people that will be here in the future.
Love it. Love it. And I'm of the generation where I love to see that your generation is taking responsibility of this in a great way. And I'm seeing it around the world, not just in Australia. We've got, I'm connected to lots of different Indigenous communities across the world. And I'm going to throw it out there to all my future guests that come on this show. I'd like you to recognise your Indigenous communities in the nations and where you live, because if it wasn't for them, your pathway to where you are today would not have happened. So, Hayley, thanks very much for bringing that to our awareness on the show today. You're the first person that's done that, and I'm in awe of you actually doing it. I think it's a marvellous thing. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And it'd be fantastic if that happened in future shows.
I will make sure it does. You can guarantee it, because at the end of the day, it's my show. So I say what goes on this channel, right? Now, we're going to talk a lot about business today, and in particular your business journey. And as I said to you before the show, this show is really about helping people learn and to share experiences and to share knowledge and know-how. So we're going to talk about your business journey. To do that, we've got to go back to the beginning. So the first question I have for you really is, why did you want to start a business?
I didn't want to start a business. I wasn't the entrepreneur that always knew I wanted to be a business owner. I wanted to help people. I wanted to. So my background, I'm a dietitian. I studied nutrition and dietetics when I finished school. I then went on and did an MBA at Deakin University. And that was really to further my studies. You know, I was 22 when I graduated. I had no idea what I wanted to do with this degree. I just received, and I thought, you know, I could get some business awareness, business knowledge, and then work out what I wanted to do. So really to delay the process. I went and I started working. I was really lucky because these positions are really hard to get, and I knew someone that was working at the North Melbourne Football Club. Now, for anyone that doesn't know, Australia is famous for Australian rules football, or the AFL, and North Melbourne Football Club is one of the, I think there are 18 teams now, but at the time it was 16 teams that were part of the AFL. And there are many Indigenous players within the AFL. Indigenous Australians make up 2.4% of the Australian population today. If you were to look at the AFL population, it would probably be more like 10-20%. Of players are Indigenous, and of the top 10% of the best players, you'd probably have 50% being Indigenous, because they really are stars. And I was talking to some of these Indigenous players about the foods that they'd eat when they would go home for pre-season. And these were foods I'd never heard of, you know, Kakadu Plum, Quandong, eating turtle as a protein source. I would never have imagined that was something that people did. And it just made me think that as a nutrition professional, as a professional that specialises in food, how did I not know about Australian cuisine and what foods were native to Australia? And that's what started the journey. It was really an aha moment. It was what have we missed in this country that we don't even know what the local cuisine is? You know, you ask any Italian what foods are local to Italy, and they'll know because they ate it last night. In Australia, we probably ate what the Italians ate last night. Our local cuisine is currently based off Vegemite and Lamingtons. It has nothing to do with Australian native produce, and that's what became my mission, to make Australian native produce something that Australians are aware of and are consuming regularly.
I'm pleased that you knew what Moreton Bay bugs were, though, because that's something that's been around for a long time, although it's probably got a very different name than Moreton Bay bugs, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know what that is, but I can tell you that, you know, of the 500 nations, we call Kakadu Plum today Kakadu Plum, but depending on the nation that you're in, they might call it Gabinj, Mimaral. There are so many names, and that's part of it. It's understanding that of those 500 clans, they all had their own language, and so fruits were called different things.
Yeah, right. Great upbringing to have an exposure through the North Melbourne Footy Club and to get all that experience. When did the light bulb moment come on to say, hey, I actually want to make a business here. I want to do something with, starting my own dream. When did that come along? I
think it was pretty simultaneous. You know, understanding that Australians had no idea what this was. It coincided with me understanding that I wanted to produce products that consumers could trust. I think that in the market today, and certainly 5 years ago, there was a lot of marketing going on, a lot of clever marketing, so that a consumer could pick up a chocolate bar that has no nutritional value and somehow think that they were eating a protein bar that was going to benefit their health. And so it was about creating a brand that consumers could trust, and at the same time, the mission behind it is having a brand that could increase awareness of Australian native ingredients.
Had you come across anybody else that was doing this before you started your business?
Not at the time. I think that there was, after doing some research, I identified that there were some key players in the space, but they were all supplying food service. They weren't supplying food and beverage manufacturers. They weren't ingredient suppliers. They didn't have their own range of product. So At the time, and they'd been around for quite a while, and there was limited penetration in the space. So I think that there was a big opportunity to increase awareness, to start the conversation, because no one was really doing it.
Now, often when you do something new and you're a pioneer in the space, you come up across a lot of naysayers and people saying that this is not going to work. Did you experience that?
I experienced many challenges. What I did experience was, at the time, I was 27, a real go-getter. And people were encouraging, because I don't think they felt threatened, and I think that's something that people often push you down when they're feeling threatened. And I was going into a space that there were no other players, and they were quite encouraging, because it all sounded good. And they were kind of like, I don't know if this is going to be successful, but it kind of ticks the boxes. And because it ticks the boxes, we'll support you and we'll, have conversations with you. And the business then was very different to what it is now. So we launched with a range of snack bars. We thought that would be a platform to start the conversation. So people would pick up this snack bar. It was called Ancient Rainforest Berry with Davidson Plum and Ribery. And they would say, while they snacked on this snack bar, this is delicious, but what's a Ribery or what's a Davidson Plum? I can taste something that's a little bit unusual but still delicious. What is it?
Yeah, right.
And that was what we thought that's how we thought would start the conversation. And then we saw it rolling out into different product lines. The feedback we had when we talked to distributors, when we spoke to retailers, was really positive. They were really excited by this concept. We had our first production run, sold out really quickly, had our second production run, and then it stopped selling. And what we very quickly identified, and this was one of the very important lessons we learned early on, was that while you might speak to the right people and they might give you the right feedback that you want to hear to move to the next phase, you don't actually know what consumers are going to do with their dollar until it comes to purchasing, even if you have the conversation with the consumers before they purchase. And that's because we all know it. We'll say, yes, we always want to support local brands that's sustainable, using recyclable packaging, giving back to communities, but they're $1 more than the competitors on the shelf. And they're on the other brand's on sale. I'm going to buy 10 of that other brand, and that brand can just sit there for now because I'm feeling the pinch this month and I just don't have that disposable income. And so we went back to the drawing board and we said, okay, people loved the concept. They just didn't love our snack bars. What can we do to get this moving? And that took us to where we are today.
Lots of travel or water under the bridge before then. I want to go back to the process that you did when you first started, because one of the things that you did, which I really like, and I really impose this on a lot of people that are thinking of starting a business, you did a lot of research in the beginning, right? You spent a lot of time. In fact, I think it was 2 years that you spent doing research before you started off. Tell us about that and tell us why you did that.
We did that for a number of reasons, and we continued having to do research after we launched as well. The 2 years doing research in the beginning was because the supply chain is so fragmented. And that's probably why there have been very few competitors that have popped up since we launched. We have over 300 suppliers, and that's not including the suppliers that supply our suppliers. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail. But we work with Indigenous communities. We work with Indigenous communities who then work with other communities. So other communities will bring their wild harvested produce to the community that we will then source off. We work with Indigenous farmers. We work with non-Indigenous farmers. And the supply chain is very fragmented and it's very difficult to source the produce. We then live in this beautiful land where remote communities are extremely remote. So the logistics to get the fruit to us is quite challenging. And also there's very limited research on the fruits themselves, so the nutritional benefits or the flavour profiles of the fruits themselves. So all that needed to be completed before we launched, because we needed to have an understanding. We needed to, one, know that if these snack bars, which we now know were a massive failure, if they were a massive success, would we be able to source the produce to be able to, commence exporting to supply the major supermarkets in Australia, which for non-Australians, there are 2 major supermarkets, Woolworths and Coles. And it's considered that you've made it if you get your product into Coles or Woolworths.
Right.
So they were the challenges, and they were what we focused on in the first couple of years.
Did you start the business only looking at the domestic Australian market as the only market you were going to supply to?
Not the only market we were going to supply to. We started the business knowing that if we could not make Australian native produce renowned in Australia, we had no chance around the world. Or I'd feel like a bit of a gimmick around the world. If you were consuming native Australian produce in America and you were consuming a Davidson Plum, and then you came to Australia and asked a local store for Davidson Plums and they had no idea what you were talking about, it wouldn't seem legit or legitimate. So I think that for us, it was about educating consumers locally, and then we could start working on exporting to other markets. And that's what we did, and that's what we have done. And today we still don't have an export strategy in place, yet about 30% of our business is exports. So we have people coming to us wanting produce from Australia And so we're supplying China, Korea, South Korea, Japan, America. We have, little bits going to other countries as well. We're in department stores throughout Vietnam. So while we're not focused on exports, if they come to us, we obviously will supply the customer.
Okay, well, one of the great things I get to do on this show is I get to connect people, because there's a lot of people that have come on the show that can help each other. And I'm just thinking of a lady I already had on the show who took her Australian tea company to the world recently and has had enormous success with that. So I'm going to connect you with her after the show to talk about that exporting side and how easy and how difficult she was. And also, I used to work for a couple of decades with the world's largest logistics and supply chain company. So when it comes to exports and connecting you with the right people in that space, then you found the right person to help you do that as well. So there you go. You've got a couple of
Thank you, Matt.
benefits
Really
out of the show.
it.
Now, let's go back to starting the business, because there's a lot of people right at this time around the world who are perhaps thinking of starting a business from their bedroom, their home office, whatever. And you went and got an MBA and you had the business theoretical understanding, but then you stepped out into the real world and you were confronted with running a business. So what were some of the biggest challenges? You've talked about some of them from a supply chain issue and what the customers expect, but I'm talking about fundamentally running a business. What did you find really difficult in the beginning?
In the beginning, it was understanding what our customers wanted. So once we identified that they didn't want the snack bars, but we knew that the story was interesting. People were interested, and that was why the distributors took our bars on and the retailers took our bars on. It was understanding what we understand what our point of difference is, which I think that if you're a company that doesn't know what your point of difference is, that's what you need to go back and figure out as a first step. But it was how can we deliver Australian native produce in a way that consumers or industry will utilize it. And that really changed. Understanding that changed our business model completely. So where we were a B2C business, it transformed us into a B2C company. We all of a sudden were a native ingredient supplier to food and beverage manufacturers, to nutraceutical manufacturers, cosmetic manufacturers, and also to food service. So having those conversations with food service, for instance, saying to them, are you interested in native produce, revealed to us that native produce had trended 10 years ago, a decade ago, and that food service was apprehensive to include Australian native produce in their menus today because they'd been let down so many times before. So they would put produce on their menu, they would sell it for a week, it would be doing really well, they'd go back to reorder and they couldn't get supply, or the supply that they could access was inconsistent to the supply that they'd previously accessed. So that led us to our business model today, which is sourcing large quantities of produce from our suppliers when it's in season, and then processing it into a shelf-stable, highly consistent, highly nutritious product that we can then supply our industry base.
We've heard the word a lot, pivoting. Businesses are pivoting when they're having to change direction. You just talked about it, how you did it in your business. Is it something that you found happened quickly once you made the decision? Were you able to make that transition to the new model quickly? How long did it take you to do that?
Because we were already processing our produce to put it into our bars. So for the first stage of the first process we were doing was freeze drying, and so the freeze dried produce we already had. So we were able to package that up and supply it to industry. But it changed the model. So it changed our supply, our sales model. It changed everything. And that took a while because you really have to understand what your strategy is. And I would say that up until last year, where we participated in the Mars Seeds of Change Accelerator program, we were still a bit confused. We were playing in both spaces. We were supplying, we were an ingredient supplier to those avenues that I discussed before, but we were also still kind of dabbling in the FMCG space. And it was only once we kind of really sat down and worked out our strategy. And I think that what small businesses sometimes lack is the theory behind it. It's the processes that big business often spend way too much time on. Yeah. We often don't spend enough time on it all. Yeah. And so developing that strategy enabled us to say, okay, we now know who we are today. And that doesn't mean that, in a year's time, 2 years' time, we might not pivot again and start focusing on the FMCG space again. But once we understood who we were, we could really focus everything that we did on that one strategy that we had in place. So, today we're actually relaunching our website, which is really targeted at B2B instead of B2C, where our first website started. We now have a couple of dedicated staff that in the sales team that are purely focused on reaching out to food and beverage manufacturers.
Before you ask me if you're listening and watching the show today, I am going to include all of the links to Hayley's business and social media, so you'll be able to get in contact with Hayley and either help out, share out, or buy her product. That's what we want to encourage. So there we go. Hayley, that journey that you've just spoken about, we're talking about really 5 years now, hasn't it? It's 2015 when you launched, so you went through that evolution, and it was only last year where you just said that you felt comfortable that you've really hit the nail on the head where you're at the moment. So that's 4 years. That's a long time. So people out there who are thinking that these magical buttons happen when you turn on a business doesn't exist, does it? What do you say to those people?
I say persevere and talk. Have those discussions with people in the industry. Listen to podcasts where people often reveal the challenges that they've faced. Get an understanding of other people's experiences, so that when you do go through the ups and downs, which happens so regularly, it could be daily that you could be flying and then you could be sinking. If you understand that other people have gone through those steps as well, then you will be more adept. You'll be more apt to focus on those challenges. I saw a really fantastic meme last week, which was of a cartoon character climbing a mountain, and they get to the top of the mountain, they have their flag at the top of the mountain, and all you see is this guy waving a flag as being super successful. But when you look down the mountain, you saw cacti all the way up, and he had prickles sticking out of his knees. And I think that is exactly it. You only really celebrate the successes, and people see the successes, but the journey to those successes is often a prickly one.
Did you see Elon Musk's latest meme that he put up about putting the flag on Mars and looking back at Earth?
No, I didn't, but I'll go and check it out.
Yeah, it's a cool one. I won't ruin it for you, but go and check it out. Now you've had
Can I just say, often also just kind of is a culmination of a few of your questions. Another pivot that we did make, which didn't fit within our strategy at all, but it's worked really well for us, is last year, as I mentioned about the export markets, we were inundated with orders from South Korea, and for Kakadu Plum in particular. Now, for those that aren't familiar with Kakadu Plum has the highest vitamin C content of any food on earth. It's wild harvested by Indigenous Australians. So it's the most organic of organic products you can imagine. And with this fantastic nutritional profile. And it was a time where Kakadu Plum wasn't in season, so we couldn't just source more. And we were quickly running out of Kakadu Plum. And so we did a bit of research into the Kakadu Plum market, into why Koreans would be so interested in Kakadu Plum. And we identified that the air pollution in Korea is really high, and that there are people that are suffering from upper respiratory issues. And we found that vitamin C is linked to helping with high vitamin C intake is linked to helping with upper respiratory issues and reduce symptoms of the common cold and flu. And so we developed a product that would reduce the Kakadu Plum requirements, because we were incorporating other ingredients, but boosting the benefits of Kakadu Plum by incorporating prebiotics and probiotics, which when combined with vitamin C are proven to improve health and reduce symptoms of upper respiratory issues. And so we very quickly launched a product which incorporated Kakadu Plum, finger lime, prebiotics and probiotics, and developed this product for the South Korean market. And I think that remaining, you said pivoting before, and I'm going to say agile now, which I think is another it word for the moment. But remaining agile at that time then led us to have a product that sold well then. But then, without realising it, in Australia, we were going to enter the worst bushfire seasons we've ever seen, and the worst. It plummeted our air quality into some of the worst in the world, similar to what we're seeing today in California. And so demand quickly increased then for a product similar to that product, because in Australia we all of a sudden had such high pollution in our air. And then, then moving on to now where COVID's an issue and people are trying to boost their immunity, not saying that our product will cure COVID, but it supports immune health. And I think they're the sorts of products that people are looking for now. Yeah,
so much packaged up there. I want to go back to something you said earlier that I've got to very generously disagree with, because you talked about the potential gimmicky value of having an export market and going into other countries before you're really established in Australia. I think you've just announced, via the way of that Korean example, that there are other cultures out there that are more ready for your type of product because of their indigenous roots. Basically what you're talking about, their understanding of nature and the benefits that nature can bring through these types of products. So I think of countries like Japan, I think of countries like Korea, I think of countries like China, who have a population who are very much into the holistic approach in life that you're offering, and that I think could be a really big boom for you. So I encourage you to really look at that export market as being something that could easily be, and excuse the pun, low-hanging fruit for you, because of that reason. And if you look at a lot of the Eastern European cultures as well, very much into the holistic approach in life, and have been using things that come out of the ground for centuries to come up with all sorts of remedies for things. So I'm going to push you on the export button a lot more today, because I think it's important for you to also, and nothing like coming home and saying, hey, look, I made myself a superstar in another country, right? So you know what Australians are like when it comes to tall poppy syndrome, right? So nothing like nothing like that. Interested in the personal journey. You talk a lot about the business aspect of it, which is great, but also I want to learn how, and I'm sure my audience wants to understand how your own personal journey evolved with this. You're doing this with your husband. It's a family commitment. You've got 2 young kids. You take on a lot to do. So talk about that. Talk about how you've been able to, and for somebody that's in the nutrition space and dietitian and well-being, you got to look after yourself as well, right?
I need to correct you. My husband is not in the business. He is currently working next to me because we're restricted to our house.
Okay, sorry. Apologies for that.
He has his own business. If you want to check it out, it's called awaydigital.com, right. And they're in the building services.
Okay.
But it is a family business. My father is my business partner.
Okay.
I don't think he recognised when I first came to him with this concept, which was 7 years ago, because we launched 2 years after the research commenced.
Yep.
That he would be so involved. I think he kind of saw himself as a bit of a business mentor, and that I'd go along my journey. And today he's very much involved on a daily basis, which has been really fantastic. And I've learned a lot. And I think I've learned a lot about family, about trust, about understanding, being empathetic, doing things on a daily basis with understanding of what's going on in different people's lives. What I've learned is I would not be able to do this, and I alluded to this when I dedicated this session to my husband. I would not be able to do this without my family and without the support that we have in place. I have 2 young kids. I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they're as demanding as any 4-year-old and 2-year-old are. We have, between my parents, my in-laws, my husband, my brothers, my sister-in-law, different people picking my kids up from school on a daily basis. Everybody is open to overlooking anything from legal documents to website design. Everyone just kind of builds everybody else up to try and make what anyone is doing within our family network as successful as possible. And that's been really fantastic. And I think that that's something that I have learned about on this journey. When you're 25 and what you're doing is partying and finishing uni, and you're working so that you can go on your next 3-month holiday. It's all about the individual. And I think that what has come out of this journey, so again, we spoke about, having a 3-month-old and being in China at an expo. My mum and dad also came for that. And my mum would bring my daughter to me so they could breastfeed while I was at the expo. And it would just be impossible to do that. And I think you'd have to sacrifice too much of another part of your life without the support network. And I think that because due to my support network, I'm able. My husband often says to me, "You can't have your cake and eat it too." And my response is, "Why not?" Like we are doing that because of our support network.
Yeah.
I can have the family life, the friends, the business life, and really a business that I'm so passionate about, that we're able to travel Australia and learn so much about our Australian culture and history because of my support network.
If you weren't doing what you're doing today, what would you be doing?
I don't know. I feel like I've been doing this my whole life, that there's nothing else in terms of my work life. What would I be doing? What if I hadn't had entered this space? I would probably be working as a dietitian in sports dietetics or potentially in a hospital. As I said to you, I didn't kind of have that entrepreneurial spirit where when I started this business, it wasn't like I've had a million different ideas. Which one will I pick to focus on for now? This has really been a passion project. That there's a cause behind this business, and that is to promote Indigenous culture and promote Australian native ingredients, and to do our part in rectifying the Australian history that is the 200 years of history in which our Indigenous people have suffered so greatly, and to try and rectify that in some way. And I think that by promoting Australian produce, by promoting Australian food and Australian culture, we're able to do that.
So when's the book coming out? Because you've had this richness of research into the Indigenous culture in Australia. You probably know a lot about it, more than most people in the community today, from your side of the fence. So it makes sound sense to me that there needs to be a literal journey with this as well, and something that you can put out to the greater good of the world.
I know you're a big book fan, and I know you're a big fan of everyone writing their story. There's no plans at the moment for a book. We're doing our thing. We're pushing we're working really hard to increase awareness of Australian native produce, to increase accessibility of Australian native produce. Currently, Australian natives, it's a really immature market, even though it's one of the oldest in the world, and we need to be working on growing the supply in order for us to make this a product range that can be accessible to everybody around the world, so that we can export copious quantities of Kakadu Plum around the world, because currently the supply isn't there. So we have, and I digress, but we have just launched a new business called the Native Harvest Initiative, which has the primary goal of increasing supply of native produce.
Okay, good to see you sticking to the core and not getting distracted. That's good to hear. Now, COVID-19 came to town a few months ago, and for a lot of people it changed their business, it changed their business model, it changed the way they're working in their business. What happened for you and your business when COVID-19 came to Australia?
What happened for us? So it seemed like it hit really quickly. It was like we were talking about COVID in China, in America, and then all of a sudden Australia was shut down like overnight. And I remember the first day we had an order. It was a Tuesday. We got an order from a distributor we'd been working with, a food service distributor that services the east coast of Australia. And the next day they cancelled the order. And that was, at a time, it was just like deep breaths, what's happening here? What does this look like for us? We sat down, we discussed it, we identified, obviously food service had hospitality throughout Australia closed down overnight, and we didn't really know when it would reopen. In Melbourne, Victoria, it hasn't really reopened. It kind of opened for very limited seatings for a couple of weeks, and then it went back out. We went back into lockdown. The rest of the country has opened up and seems to be operating quite normally, but what we had to do as a business was identify where these ingredients would be celebrated during this time. What industries would be saying we need Australian native ingredients when we're potentially experiencing 10% unemployment and there's going to be very limited disposable income. And we identified that probably is going to be the supplement industry, that people are looking on ways to improve their health. We saw ourselves in March, as I think a lot of businesses saw, a huge spike in sales when COVID first hit and panic buying started, and that was predominantly for Kakadu Plum and for our vitamin C booster. So we started targeting companies that we thought would benefit from highly nutritious produce. And we've spoken a lot about Kakadu Plum, but Kakadu Plum's not the only one. In terms of vitamin C, there's finger lime, there's finger lime and desert lime. There's, in terms of health and well-being and beauty, and anthracite and different antioxidants, there's Davidson plum, there's mountain pepper leaf. So we started targeting supplement companies, and that has actually seen us grow during this time rather than shrink like many of our competitors. So we've been really fortunate. We've worked really, really hard to make sure that we'd be able to continue and meet our commitments to our suppliers, because our worst day, and what we actually pride ourselves on not doing, is saying to a supplier, we can't take your crop that we've placed a purchase order for 6 months ago.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, as far as mentors go, you talked about your father. Have you got any other official mentors or mentoring process in place for your business?
I have a number of people that have helped me along the way. They're probably unofficial mentors, but they're certainly the people that I call when we're considering different ideas. I don't have an official business coach or anything like that, and I think that I would actually benefit from one. So if you have anyone in mind, that would be fantastic. But there have definitely been people that have kind of come on this journey and have been very successful in their own rights. Be it in the supplement world or in the hospitality industry, that have been so open and generous with their time and really sat down with me and talked different concepts through with me at any point in time.
Yeah, I like the way you talk about it, and you going back to when you said you started your business, it's critical for everybody to understand out there, when you have an idea that you want to take to the world, it's going to be a world of people that help you. So surround yourself with the good people, the people that you trust, the people that are going to be by your side through thick and thin, and it'll make the journey a lot easier, although it's not an easy journey, but it's a journey that can be embraced with others. And you have a lot of fun too working with these people as well, right, Hayley? It's
exactly.
You share the successes together, you share the failures together, and all the lessons learnt together, I should say, and it all makes it what it is. So let's get the crystal ball out, because it sounds to me like you've got
I also think you learn a lot about yourself when you hear when people that you trust tell you information that might not be what you were envisaging. You learn to process information in a different way, to lower that ego and to welcome other opinions, because if you don't do that, then you're almost destined to fail.
Fantastic point. So let's hone in on that. Over the last 5 years, what pieces of advice have been most critical to you and your business from others?
Not to jump. This is from my father, who is the most level-headed man you'll ever meet. His advice is to always think things through. I tend to work very quickly, and while I think having both of us in the business has been very beneficial, he will listen to all opinions. He will take on the advice. He'll take the considered approach and think things through and discuss them, so that you do hear the other points of view. I think as you grow as a business, and we're still a very small business, don't get me wrong, but as you grow as a business, to remain open like you are as a small business, to remain agile like you are as a small business, because what we're seeing now in the larger organisations, and I'm talking very large organisations, that they will have a concept and then they'll come to us and say, can you do it? Can you do the product development? Can you come up with everything? Because for us to get this through our business, it's going to take us 2 years, and you'll be able to come back to us, within a couple of months. So to remain agile, and to remain open.
What would you do differently if you started again, knowing what you do now?
Knowing what I know now, I probably wouldn't do it. I think a lot of business owners would say that, with the challenges, I probably wouldn't have done it when I did it. I found out I was pregnant the same weekend that we launched the business.
Oh, wow.
So, when I was in China for that expo, I turned to my husband and I said, I think I'm having a mental breakdown. But at the same time, would I change anything now from the point I'm at? I wouldn't. I've loved it. It's given me a real sense of purpose, a real sense of identity through this time of having 2 children, which I'm so grateful for.
Okay, now you're going to let me get the crystal ball out, okay?
Yeah.
Where's the business going to be in 3 years from now?
In 3 years from now, I would hope that the Australian Superfood Co. is exporting, that the supply is there to really focus on the export markets, to have our own range of consumer goods that focus and celebrate Australian native produce. I would hope that when you speak to any Australian throughout the country and you ask them what is Australian cuisine, they will come back and, talk about quandongs and Kakadu plums and wattle seed and some of the native produce that we have growing in Australia. There are over 5,500 edible species within Australia, and I feel like we know of about 30 at the moment. The Native Harvest Initiative will be up and running, supplying, ensuring supply of Australian native produce. And I think that Indigenous people will be a much bigger part of this supply chain. Currently, for us, it's about 40%, but it's estimated that Indigenous people within the native food space make up only 1.5%. So that, I think, will change a lot.
And your children will be 7 years and 5 years old.
And potentially 2 or 3. Which I shouldn't say too loudly.
No, there you go.
But I'd love another child.
Gary, did you hear that? What about the exit strategy? Do you have an exit strategy for the business?
We don't. We are definitely open to exiting the business in some capacity. I think that we would only sell to the right buyer, though. We wouldn't sell to somebody, or we'd welcome investment as well, but we wouldn't simply take on money. We would need someone that can add to the business, that would respect the way of the business, and be able to bring in a skill set that we don't currently have, so that to help us grow the business. So I think that it'll be a special person, but I think that there are many people out there that would like to invest in a company like ours, working with the supply chain and also potentially with the FMCG range.
I know 2 people that are listening to this show today who are going to be calling you with a potential for doing exactly that. So guys, and you know who I'm talking to, if you are going to contact Hayley, have a think through what the big global approach is going to be with this one, because it's a very exciting opportunity. Hayley, for someone starting a business out there today in COVID-19 times, because let's face it is different than normal business conditions, and who knows what we're going to go back to at the end of this, because it's going to be a whole new world. What's your tips of advice on starting a business under these conditions that we're living in today?
I think, besides for, talk to your potential customer base and see if there's actually a need for your idea, take the risk. We see, some of the best businesses come out of financial hardships. Like look at Airbnb, Uber, they came out of the GFC. And I think that, I hope that I'm factually correct when I said that, but there are many businesses that came out of the GFC that are now huge. That during these times, it's when people identify what they really need, and potentially. Did that just disconnect?
Yeah, I've got an audio issue here. I lost you then. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I heard something happen, and then it's come back.
Something tripped it. I think we're right now. Okay, yeah. Sorry, carry on. Yep.
So I think it's take risks. It's, for many people, it will be what they would feel like, what do I have to lose? There are so many people that are suffering a lot right now. And I see it. I've got a friend whose husband was actually made redundant during COVID, and he's gone on and together with my husband and my brother, who are also business partners, they've formed Away Teams, which is outsourcing a range of services that businesses currently aren't performing for themselves. So it might be from social media, banking and accounting, those sorts of roles that has come from this time, and for my friend, from serious adversity that he's had to overcome, being made redundant during COVID with 3 children and facing real challenges.
Yeah, and that's what I love about this period. Even though there is a lot of hardship out there, I think if you look on the half glass full side, there's a lot of opportunity that's going on right now. People like yourself looking for new opportunities as well. And these are all inspirational times. So before we end up today, Hayley, anything else that you want to share that can inspire someone out there who's wanting to take that entrepreneurial path, and maybe talk about the family side of it, because the family business side of it, having your father involved, is a unique proposition. It's not right for everybody, but what's your advice around doing something with the family?
I think doing something with a family, or having a business partner in general, you have to know that you can work well together. I'm really lucky that my dad is very smart, very experienced, and very patient. I don't know if he would pick me if we went back in time, but I'd certainly pick him. But making sure that you've got skill sets that complement one another.
Yeah.
And I think looking to your support network and looking to people that you know already, because you often know their pros and cons before you start the business. Yep. Where when you go into a new business with somebody and you might only have seen them over a couple of dinners or during some good times, you won't quite know how they'll act through the challenges and through the hardships.
Good piece of advice there. Hayley, before we close up the Global Business Podcast today, do you have a farewell from the Indigenous quote that you gave us before? Do they have a welcome, but do they have a farewell? No?
But I will look into that for you and I'll come back to you.
Yeah, please do, because we should say hello, but we should also say goodbye in the right ways, yeah?
And I think that it's learning, learning the land that you're on, learning the language that from the culture that you are, the way you do reside is really important. And it's also important to make sure that the culture continues to be celebrated, the history continues to be remembered, because for Indigenous Australians, and I'm sure Indigenous people throughout the world, their culture is often passed on orally. And if you don't know the language, or if it hasn't continued to be told, the messages to be told, then it won't be in the future.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for allowing me to pivot my show today, and every future guest is going to have to stand up and acknowledge their local Indigenous community. So thank you very much for that.
I can't wait to learn more.
Hayley Blieden, thanks for joining us on the show, and all the best in the future and with all the endeavours that you're undertaking.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me, Mark.